The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello and welcome to our educational session on cutting physician network losses. This is really about HSG's philosophy and frameworks. Today we'll be talking about the factors that contribute to subsidies for employed physician networks. We'll talk about how we recommend preparing an appropriate subsidy target based upon benchmark data, really important thing to get correct. And then we'll finally talk about how we help clients outline a prioritized performance improvement plan. I'm Travis Ansel, Managing Partner of HSG. With me is Eric Andrioli, Director.
Hello.
Today we're going to start by talking about our observations on physician network losses. Now, obviously, what's interesting is even the word losses has a lot of definitions depending on what health system you're at and what physician network you're talking about. But to us, when we talk losses, we talk about the net financial performance of our employed physician practices on direct expenses plus allocated health system overhead. So those three things together, employed practices, direct expenses plus allocated overhead, is what makes up losses, subsidies, investment. Everybody has a different term for it. For us, it's important to use this standard definition when benchmarking. So the benchmark tools that are available out in the industry and that we have proprietary to us are all based on that definition. We've seen clients that don't use that definition that have a very hard time benchmarking themselves appropriately. So that's why we always start with definition. One of the things organizations struggle the most with is allocations of overhead, which can, if you're under allocating, can make you look really good, or if you're over allocating, can make your practices look really bad. But that needs to be done correctly in order to meet that definition and in order to be able to benchmark properly. What do we see from health systems in today's environment? Subsidies on employed networks have always been a pressure point since they really started to grow in this latest round, which probably started about 2006 to 2008 in most markets and is still occurring in other markets. We do have what we call our physician network evaluation survey, which goes out to hundreds of health systems a year and asks for their views on different components of employed physician networks. And one that's always interesting is the subsidies of our employed network are financially sustainable. Do you strongly agree or strongly disagree? What we generally get is a really wide array of responses across many, many cohorts, with administration, which on this screen is that bright teal box, tending to be a little more negative, providers being a little more positive. But what we generally see, and you can see it very clearly on this slide, is when we talk about what's the provider's view, almost a quarter of the respondents to the survey are providers saying, I don't know. And that's because a lot of organizations don't even have a definition of financially sustainable. And if they do, it's certainly not shared with their providers. So our philosophy, we hear a lot of organizations talking about wanting to get to zero losses. And if these practices were sustainable and independent practice, why aren't they now? From our view, the economics of employment are going to inevitably drive subsidies when you talk about bringing practices into a hospital structure with hospital benefits, with hospital overhead. And really, and it's not just that, it's the economics of competition for scarce resources, which in this case are providers, which is driven up by competition between health systems for those scarce resources. So you're inevitably going to have subsidies. Getting to break even is unrealistic in today's environment and is going to continue to be, because competition for providers is not going to go away, even if our reimbursement mechanism finally changes from fee-for-service to fee-for-value. In our view, optimization of losses should be the focus. That's not just at the network level, but that's at the practice level. There are some specialties that are inevitably going to lose more than others. That doesn't make them worth less or more to the delivery of healthcare in your network or within your health system. But what we need to do is get all of them to an optimal level. And that really requires, which we see some organizations struggle with, requires us to take a robust view of both halves of the P&L. So we're fond of saying you can't cut your way to success, especially in a physician network. You start taking away resources, things don't start taking away things on the bottom half of the P&L, and the top half of the P&L tends to go down with it. So focusing on both halves of the P&L is required in order to get to that optimal level of losses. And what's really important and we see a lot of organizations struggle with, is our definition of what optimal is from a performance improvement perspective might not be the same as our competitor across the streets. Because we really have to do it in the context of where we are as a network, where we are in our evolution, where we are in the development of our culture, where we are in the development of our operational competencies. Because if we're trying to be someone that has, if we're trying to be the same as Cleveland Clinic, which has 50 years of culture and 50 years of operational expertise, being there in 2 years, 5 years is probably unrealistic. But what we can do is continue to improve from where we are right now. And that relates to our view of how networks grow and evolve over time. Anyone who's worked with us or read our materials probably familiar with what we call our physician network growth phases, which is our view of 6 distinct phases which employed networks progress through over time. We tend to focus, especially when we're talking about losses, we're generally talking about the operational chaos stage. Operational chaos is when we've gone through our growth period where we spiked from 50 to 250 employed providers, or we spiked from 150 to 700, typically over a short time period. We get a lot of excitement about, look how big our network's getting, look how strong our network's getting. And then the realities of, oh my gosh, we've acquired 400 providers over the last 6 years, and we really haven't built the infrastructure to deal with it. That tends to be where those losses start to add up. We've brought a bunch of people in, we've changed salary structures, we've changed benefit structures, we've probably onboarded them onto a new EMR, we've probably tried to integrate their staff into what current management staff we had, but we're realizing we don't have the infrastructure in place to run a network of this size. And that really becomes a challenge, because when we start to lose, when we start to have real losses, and that subsidy starts to show up on the health system P&L pretty prominently, that's when we start to see board and executive hesitancy to continue investing in the network, either by growing it or by investing in an infrastructure. Then you start seeing providers getting frustrated because they're getting killed over losses. Their first agenda topic of every meeting with provider is losses on the network, and they're saying, I'm doing what I was doing before. Why am I so much worse? I'm doing what you wanted me to when you acquired me. And network leadership, which is likely in that operational chaos phase, way understaffed, way lacking the capabilities it needs to run a network of the size. They're feeling continually pressured to fight fires every day because they basically have they have no consistency or management philosophy across the entire network. So they're basically having to treat every practice, and in some cases every provider, as a one-off, and everything is a challenge, everything is a fight. So that's what operational chaos is to us, and that's generally where we see people most concerned about losses before they've really made that investment in infrastructure that allows the network to kind of get past the subsidy discussion. And so where we want to go next is talking a little bit about how to put your subsidies in context and define realistic targets. And Eric, you're going to talk about that.
Yeah, thanks, Travis. I think you teed that up very nicely. It's clear we spend a ton of time talking to health system leaders, and we hear similar questions. People ask us, are our losses appropriate? How much should I be losing? How do I even know what financial success looks like? And you can see there's one common theme to all those questions, and it's putting losses into context. And that's a really tough thing to do, really, because there's no common belief around how much a network should lose. And a lot of reasons Travis just talked about, but teeing up things and kind of consolidating things down into 3 reasons here. And the first, and Travis just talked about this, is the variable progression along the growth curve. Networks who are in rapid growth are going to view their losses differently than operational chaos versus strategic focus versus somebody who's in the value phase and really understands the value that network brings in terms of value-based care delivery and everything like that. So those networks are all going to view losses through a different lens, and that makes it tough to kind of coalesce around, hey, this is how much networks should be losing. And the second is because even within a similar market or even within networks in the same phase, there's going to be differing views on the role of physician enterprise. And you remember Travis kind of talked about this too, because, if we think the two sides of what we consider might be a continuum of delusion, on one side, you have hospital leaders who say, well, these private practices were financially sustainable when they were independent, so now that we've employed, they shouldn't be losing any money. And Travis did a good job talking about why our philosophy thinks that that's a little bit crazy. But on the other side of the coin, we've heard CFOs say, employed network losses don't matter to me at all because we're making so much up on the hospital side, so I'm not even going to waste my time looking at the losses on the employed group side. And that's pretty crazy too, because like Travis said, it does make sense to optimize the losses and to think about them. Otherwise, you're leaving money on the table. And the third thing that we'll spend a little more time talking about is suboptimal interpretation of benchmark data. And when I say that, a lot of people think, hey, shouldn't this be pretty easy? I mean, after all, if I know the benchmark and I can go to MGMA Data Dive, or I can open a book, or a lot of articles that post benchmarks, and I can find some sort of benchmark that says, multi-specialty groups should be losing $186,000 per physician. And then I can look at my P&L. And if I'm a 115 physician employed group and I'm losing $20 million, I can just do the math and say, well, I'm losing $174 per physician, and the benchmark loss is $186 per physician. So I can come to the conclusion, hey, I'm doing just great. But the problems with that are a few fold. But first, that really doesn't give us a lot of indication on what's going on under the hood. Travis talked about focusing on both sides of the P&L. There's a lot of expense structure things you want to look at. Is it, if I am doing good, if that is the right conclusion, is it because I'm collecting a lot? Is it because my expenses are low? You want to drill down so you can understand that variation from the benchmark. But also, backing up, it might not even be the right number to compare yourselves to. The conclusion that you're doing great might be fundamentally flawed for a few reasons. And so there's things we want to consider that might lead to having a flawed benchmark comparison, or flipping it to the positive, 5 things to consider to make sure you're getting the right number. And the first is picking the right comparison groups. Whatever number you're generating, you want to make sure that it's a right group of providers, so you're comparing apples to apples. 2, you want to use the most relevant ratios. You got to think about per physician, per provider, per work review, and those might mean different things or lead to different conclusions, and you might want to use them in different scenarios. And then 3 is make adjustments. You've got your data, you've got the benchmark data. You need to make sure that you're looking at the same thing and comparing the right number to a benchmark data that reflects what you need to compare it to. 4 might seem, I'm sure seems obvious to all the smart people listening to this session, but it is worth saying. You need to apply thought and acknowledge nuance to the benchmarks. Variation from the benchmarks is not always inherently bad. You have to understand what it means. You have to understand whether it's warranted or unwarranted. And then number 5 is having a framework to assess status quo and identify opportunities. Because one number does not tell the whole story, and you have to have a framework to bring multiple analyses together. So probably those first 3 I'll dive into a little more. And the first one, when I say pick the right comparison groups, that's really important, because we see a lot of groups say that they want to compare themselves to hospital-owned multi-specialty, which makes sense. If it's a group that employs multiple specialties and they're hospital-owned, it makes sense. It seems like that would be a good benchmark. But you have to think about groups that might vary in composition or makeup from the groups that are filling out the multi-specialty survey for something like MGMA. One example that we've got on the screen, we worked with a group that was very surgical heavy. So they had a lot more surgeons than they did primary care. And when we looked at the MGMA kind of distribution of, hey, who's filling out that multi-specialty category, it was way heavier on the primary care. And so what we did for this group, and what's on the screen here, is we went practice by practice and we said, hey, let's not use the multi-specialty. Let's use a benchmark that matches each individual practice, and then let's roll it up and create a weighted average. And so I'm not going to bore you with the details, but if you look all the way at the bottom of this table, what we can see is if we look at a weighted average based on the specialty types for each practice, this group should lose about $360,000 per physician. And that's because it's skewed so heavily towards surgeons. And if you compare that to what's in the MGMA multi-specialty, that was 158,000 in 2019, which is the data year that represents. So you can see that this group kept beating themselves up for saying, hey, how come we've never been at the MGMA median for multi-specialty? And the reason is, well, they have a provider composition that's going to make it very, very hard for them to ever be at that multi-specialty median. And a more realistic target might be that 360 figure. And again, that's not set in stone. There's a lot of things that we would want to think about from that. But that 360 number, based on how surgeon heavy they are, might be a more realistic target. And that's really important. And then also really important, moving on to the next one, is using the right ratios. And so, as a lot of people who have used benchmarks know, that they're available in per physician, per provider, or per work RVU basis. You can kind of look at them in a few different ways. But if we think of a group, an example group that we've done some work with, think about a group that's very, very APP heavy, but also very, very productive. So in this example group, almost half of their physicians were producing work RVUs at levels above the MGMA 75th percentile. And that's a very productive group. So tons of RVUs being produced. Also, the whole group was about a 1-to-1 physician to APP ratio. In the MGMA multi-specialty median, there's about 0.37 APPs for every physician. So that's really, you can see this group fundamentally way more productive, fundamentally way more skewed towards APPs than the MGMA kind of average group that's filling out that multi-specialty category. And that does a few things when we look at the benchmarks. So if we think about the benchmarks on a revenue, on a cost, or even a loss basis, if we think about this group and we say, hey, we're going to take a per physician approach, you can see that on a per physician, the group is losing $371,000 per physician, and the MGMA median is 126. They're blowing that out of the water. But that's because they're A, really productive, and B, for every one physician, you got a ton more APPs than when you compare yourselves to the MGMA benchmark. So that per physician number really isn't the right one to use. Then if you think about the per provider benchmarks, you can see, hey, this group's a lot more in line, but still kind of over the benchmarks. And that really comes down to, hey, for all the providers, they're just producing a ton of work RVUs, which produces more revenue, but also produces more cost from the provider comp point of view. So maybe the best way to think about this particular group is on a per work RVU basis, because they are producing so many work RVUs. And so that's not to say we want to cherry pick the data. We don't want to find the ratio that makes us look best, but we want to use all this other contextual information to find the ratio that's going to give us the right conclusion and the right findings, if that makes sense. So next is number 3, making adjustments. And we think adjustments are really important to make sure that the numbers you're comparing are apples to apples, because every organization has a different definition of financial accounting and how they roll things up for accounting purposes, but also the benchmarks. Well, any benchmark, MGMA, for example, has very strict definitions about, hey, what they're calling certain categories and what rolls into certain benchmarks. And you might need to adjust one or the other to make sure you're comparing apples to apples. So in this example, we want to consider a network that allocates certain hospital revenue back to the practices for their financial reporting purposes. And that is not what MGMA does when they produce revenue benchmarks or loss benchmarks that tie in those revenue benchmarks. So for example, this group, before they made any adjustments, they were losing about 20 million. The projected range based on the MGMA data was 20 to 35 million. So they were saying, hey, we're doing pretty good. But that included all those allocations of hospital revenue. So really, when we backed all that out, we were able to show them, look, your group's not as financially healthy as you think, because you've been using all this revenue to kind of prop it up. And if you do a true apples to apples comparison to the benchmarks, there's actually a lot of opportunities. And that doesn't apply to just revenue, but expense allocations, staffing allocations, all those things where you might have things on the hospital side, but really they're being allocated or not being allocated to the practices. And the last two I'll go through a little quicker because, as I mentioned earlier, applying thought and knowledge and nuance is really important. Variation from the benchmarks is not always inherently good or bad. You have to understand sometimes it's warranted, sometimes it's unwarranted. And if we think about an example where, hey, it might be really warranted, if there's a group in the value phase, as we've been talking about, they have a heavy value emphasis, they might be employing people in the practices to help achieve their value strategies. Might be care coordinators, clinical practice leads, other supporting staff that you might not have if you didn't have such a value focus. So then if you think about it, if you compare yourself to benchmarks, with that goal, you might be high. You might look high on staffing ratios or staffing costs, and that's okay given the goals of the organization. So that's what we mean, and when we say apply thought and knowledge nuance, we really think that's important. And then lastly, having frameworks to assess status quo and identify opportunities. One number, one data, one piece of analysis does not tell the whole story. You really have to have a framework to bring together multiple analyses. So if you're looking at things on the collection side, if you're looking at things on the expense side, if you're looking at things on the volume side, and then if you're looking at all these underlying things, you have to have a framework to bring all that together so we can really understand what our opportunities are. And to talk more about that, to dive a little more into that, I'm going to turn it back over to Travis.
All right, thanks, Eric. So as Eric said, important to have a framework that allows you to comprehensively look at everything that can drive changes on the P&L and not get too focused on one or two issues. In this section, we'll be presenting our framework for how we help networks comprehensively assess performance improvement opportunities. We call this our subsidy reduction framework, where basically we help clients answer 4 questions about their network that we consider critical. 1, can we increase collections on existing volume, meaning we do no more work, we add no more expense. How do we just increase the reimbursement for the work that we're already doing? And that can get into things as broad as what are our commercial payer rates like, and are we still negotiating to strengthen hospital rates and lower ambulatory rates? Have we even negotiated rates for our ambulatory practices, which is something we've seen in the past year with a large network that hasn't gone back to their payer in nearly 10 years. What does your fee schedule look like? Is it regularly updated? Are we charging enough to make sure we're capturing everything that we can? Do we have a strategy for managing payer mix and demographics? Now, obviously, some markets are more challenged by their demographics than others, but even then, is our strategy for who comes into our practices and who's accessing our schedule consistent with our financial goals for the network? Revenue cycle effectiveness. Are we doing a good job of getting paid for the work that we're doing? And 5, coding and documentation. Are we appropriately documenting the work that we're doing and coding it at a level consistent with our level of effort? Or is there an opportunity to move that up as well? The second question is, can we decrease expenses on existing volume, meaning we do no less work, but we are able to decrease expenses on that work, which can sometimes mean we need to look at provider mix, moving our ratio of physicians and advanced practitioners to something that's a little, we've seen networks with ratios of 5, 6, 7 to 1 physicians to advanced practitioners, or even networks that just utilize advanced practitioners as glorified scribes or MAs. So do we have the opportunity to keep our capacity, but change our mix in a way that is financially beneficial? Staffing levels and utilization. We see under and overstaffing by magnitudes as an issue across many health systems in the country. So how do we get to the right level of staffing, and how is that staff being utilized? Staffing compensation is sometimes an opportunity. Administrative overhead is frequently an opportunity. So what are we applying to the practices? Are we getting value? Is the network getting value for it, or is there an opportunity to move that overhead? Same thing with practice overhead. A lot of networks still have their practices exactly where they bought them. In buildings that may or may not be efficient for what we're trying to do. We may be running 30 practices when we need to be running 12, which gets into practice consolidation. So is there an opportunity to keep our practice operations intact and seeing the same volume, but reduce the overhead? 3, can we generate more volumes with our existing provider and staff structure? So basically, we've made all these basically fixed cost investments. Can we generate more volume with them, which gets into issues like patient retention? Are we tracking where our patients go, how they utilize our care continuum, and building a patient attraction and retention strategy that allows us to get those patients in our network more than we're doing right now? Are we controlling the providers' schedules and making sure that they're full to the extent that we feel would drive financial sustainability and optimal losses or optimal subsidies for our network? Do we have sufficient patient access or an access strategy or even a common definition of access that allows us to ensure that patients who need to be seen are able to be seen and don't leave our network? Do we have efficient practice operations? Do we have a care management strategy that ensures we get paid for the transitional care, chronic care management codes, some of the work we're doing that we see a lot of networks just not getting paid for or not taking advantage of? Service and procedure mix. So we as you might imagine, you can see a lot of providers that are in the same specialty doing very different types of work. So if we're subsidizing an orthopod with a very limited scope versus an orthopod with a pretty broad scope, those are really two different choices, and maybe we need a different type of orthopod if we have one that doesn't like to cut. And then finally, top of license provider utilization, which that top of license we see probably most frequently applied to the discussion about advanced practitioners, but it's also relevant for the physician. If we have physicians that are doing their own workups, if we have physicians that are seeing their patients with one chronic condition and just need medication management, that's not really very efficient. And that's something that we should be pushing down in our practice model and ensuring that our physicians are able to do their top of license work as well. And then the fourth question we ask is, should we divest or add any providers or practices, which is a bit of a taboo question, except for when there's really big problems. But we tend to think this is the right time to be asking that question for most networks around the country, because if you look at how most current employed networks are built, they're built off of decisions made in the early to mid 2000s, right? We needed to start employing. We need to employ these practices. We had a land rush for providers in our market where we had 2 or 3 competitors all trying to buy everybody up, and we bought who we could. We've had more and more providers approach us for employment or say they're leaving. And we find a lot of current management teams basically being placed in charge of these very large employed provider networks that were built based on decisions and based on strategies from 15 years ago. And not to say that maybe every network isn't already in its optimal mix of practices, but we've seen a handful that are still kind of slaves to decisions that were made well before current management was in place. And so, with everything going on in the world and hospital finances being what they are, this is not a bad time to ask, is everyone that we're employing truly relevant? And what does happen if we decide to divest any practices or providers? So let's dive into those and look at the impact. So when we talk about the framework, so we've talked about the components of the framework. So how do we utilize the framework? Well, we recommend defining revenue and cost per something. In this case, we're going to talk about work RVUs because work RVUs is probably the most relevant to most health systems, at least in our half of the country right now. So if we think about a fictional network with that did 1 million work RVUs in its last year, losing $50 million. That basically puts us, when we looked at the revenue per work RVU, we're looking at about $75 a work RVU. We're looking at about $125 of cost per work RVU. So if we focus on our first question in the framework, can we increase collections on existing volume? We're talking about how realistic is it that we can go from our 75 to 77, 79, 81, 83, 85, 87. And you can see we have those kind of color coded, because one of the things that this framework helps executive teams do is really set realistic expectations. So we've had networks come to us and say, well, our health system finances require that we cut the subsidy in half, but we don't want to lose any providers. We just need to make this work. This type of framework really gives the ability to say, well, but how much can we really move? And when you start applying, as Eric said, thought and nuance to our benchmarks, and we look at that $75 per work RVU and say, well, 79 to 81 for your mix of specialties is about the revenue per work RVU we should expect. So getting there might be realistic. But that 125, how much do we have to cut that 125 to get to where you want to be? And we start realizing, well, I have to cut my expense structure by 33% to get there, or 40% to get there. That's unrealistic. So what this framework helps do is basically say, what are reasonable expectations for how much we can move? So in terms of cost, in terms of moving revenue per work RVU, if we're able to do those influencing factors at the top of the screen, we look at our rates, we manage revenue cycle more effectively, we improve coding and documentation. That gives us the ability to move kind of down the table towards a better revenue per work RVU. Similarly, by decreasing expenses on current volume, we start going across on the x-axis, and we start dropping down our cost per work RVU. So we're more aggressively managing our provider mix and measuring our staff levels and utilization and right-sizing staffing, and we're getting our practices consolidated and dropping overhead. That's how we start moving cost per work RVU. And if we can move from that 125 to 119, that's $6 million a year. That's real money. But we have to have a comprehensive focus. We can't cut our way up. We can't just cut staff. We can't just consolidate practices and say we're going to get there. We really have to take a look at everything, and we have to do it on both sides of the P&L. In terms of generating more volume within the existing cost structure, there we're also lowering our cost per work RVU, because we're continuing to generate revenue at the same rate, but by spreading by spreading the same cost over more work RVUs, we're dropping our cost per work RVU. So that means we're taking our existing fixed costs like our providers, our staff, our overhead, and we're putting more patients through it, or we're generating more revenue with the same patients, or we're generating more revenue through better utilization of care management. We're able to see more patients because we've got our cardiologists seeing chronically ill comorbid patients, as opposed to patients that just need their medication managed. So that allows us to spread our cost over more volume. And then we get into the question of divestiture, which can really move you any direction. But as long as you're making the right divestiture decisions, it should move you. Hopefully it moves you in both directions. It moves you to the right across the x-axis, and it moves you down the y-axis, so that we're both increasing revenue and decreasing cost per work RVU. One more note on divestiture considerations. As we said, we think this is probably the right time. Again, we didn't see a whole lot of employed networks grow strategically. We saw a lot of networks grow by frequent, rapid acquisition, usually by management teams that are not currently in place. Sometimes, that's just healthcare. That's not saying that the networks that made those decisions are now all lost their jobs. But it really makes sense as you're going through a process like this and consciously benchmarking all these elements of your network and making judgments about how well things are working. This is really the time to determine how well does this practice or this provider fit with the direction that we want to take the network. And then you can even layer on top of that, we start getting away from financial questions and into questions just about, is this provider, or do we have the providers that have a shared vision for us with us about where this network is heading within the context of the health system? Is this provider helping promote the desired culture? And when you bring all those things together, those are the criteria by which we make good divestiture considerations. and improve the finances of the network while also improving, maybe the strategic direction and the cultural direction of the network. And finally, what we wanted to touch on was just some organizational capabilities needed to achieve performance improvement, because we can look at all those things that we just talked about, and people in suits can sit around in health systems and talk about these things. But really, unless we have the structures in place, unless we have the provider engagement in place, a lot of those things, some of those things are things that your C-suite can control. A lot of those things require physicians to be bought into to control. And so we want to talk about a couple things. One is getting into place a shared vision of the network. And I briefly referenced that on the last slide, but an actual documented description of where do we as a group of providers and an administrative team, where do we see this network heading over 5 to 10 years? And that's not a few bullet points. That's lengthy, that's descriptive, that tells exactly where do we want to be? What is this network going to look like? Who's the right type of provider to be in here? What does it mean to be financially sustainable? What does it mean to have providers involved in leadership and governance, physician-led, professionally managed? What do those things mean to us? And then start building your culture around that. And why is this in a performance improvement educational session? Because we consider it critical to give context to providers about why financial sustainability is so important. And it's not just because we need to improve the health system's finances. It's that financial sustainability is a core of who we are. And if we can't be financially sustainable, we can't drive the strategy of the network, and we can't be the most relevant part of the health system strategy, because we're always going to be that black mark on the hospital's finances. The second thing is, we see a lot of network. We referenced it in the first section when talking about being in the right, having the right view of your subsidies in the context of your network's evolution. When we see networks really start to generate losses, we tend to see overreaction by not investing in infrastructure that will help govern a network of the size that you've built. And so to us, that means lack of dedicated resources, trying to share too many health system resources and not dedicating resources to the group. That means excessive span of control for your president or executive director of your network, who should have 5 to 7 direct reports, but in networks that we've seen might have 20 or 25, with a handful of directors who also have 20 or 25, which makes accountability and mentorship just about impossible. We see disconnects between administrative and physician leadership. So we've seen some networks do physician leadership very well. We see some networks where physician leadership means once a month we get a group of physicians in the room, the administrative team tells them a lot of things, and their work really does not impact the direction of the network. And so when we see that kind of disconnect, what we get is the physicians who are most critical that we get engaged and have help us shape the financial future of the network, when they're not actually being engaged as part of the management structure, their work really doesn't, their time and effort really isn't valuable. We see gaps in capabilities of practice level leadership. Usually this is, we've acquired practices, we've onboarded the existing staff. We now have a bunch of weak practice managers because that was what was in the practice when we acquired it. And so when we see that practice level leadership gap, that usually means that our next level up in the network gets overworked trying to hold those people accountable and mentor them, and kind of creates a chain reaction going up the org chart. And then finally, we see a lack of standardization of process leading to daily firefighting. So if we don't have standardized policies and procedures across the network, if we don't have standardized EMR across the network, if we don't have a culture which generally holds providers and staff accountable by itself, that means our leadership team is having to spend their day dealing with a bunch of one-off problems and having to deal with them directly, which we call that daily firefighting, and that's bad enough as it is. But what it really does is limit your ability to create organizational change, because there's no time to think about strategy. There's no time to think about evolution. All there is fighting against the day-to-day. And then the last thing we want to talk about in terms of moving the network forward and how you take advantage of performance opportunities, performance improvement opportunities, is thinking about compensation. And a lot of networks think of compensation as a performance improvement opportunity in and of itself. We're paying our physicians too much. We really have to get our arms around this. And that's not why this is on here, but this is saying, we have to really think about what are we talking to our physicians? What are we incentivizing our physicians to do? And is it consistent with the direction our network is heading? And even then, we have to think about when we are going down a level, when we think about what we're paying physicians, is it driving the behavior we want, or all we're doing is creating compliance or retention risks? And so we really need to get that alignment between compensation and productivity, if productivity is what you're trying to incentivize. That the compensation model has to be right before we get the providers on board and working with us. So that wraps up our educational session for today. If you're looking for supplemental resources, we were published in MGMA's Connections magazine in January. That link is live on the screen. We also recently published 2 articles by Mr. Eric Andrioli.
That's me.
Who wrote an article called 10 Key Questions for Reducing Employed Group Physician Subsidies, and then recently wrote an article about our network opportunity analysis, which helps organizations determine what their ROI would be on employed provider network performance improvement. So with that, we thank you for your time. Please feel free to reach out to us, and thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Like a stop broadcast button.
Yeah, it seems like there should be. Here, let's